I've been debating on sharing this story with anyone outside of my small circle of people that were there. But I want to share my experience in hopes that it saves someone's life or to give understanding of what someone else has experienced. Late fall 2010, in northern Canada, I went deep into the wilderness with my father and my eldest brother to hunt for moose. We left in the early morning, just before sunrise, trying to cover as much distance as possible before nightfall. We traveled winding rivers and had to repeatedly portage over rapids all day. We decided to set up camp just over halfway to our destination. My father figured that we'd make the rest of the journey tomorrow. Well, when everyone bedded down for the night, I decided to go grab some firewood and relieve myself down by the bank of the river, just out of reach of the light from the campfire. Out from the tree line, about 15 yards away, I could hear rustling in the bushes. I watched the area where I heard the noise and focused on that spot. I felt kind of funny, dizzy/lightheaded, and I could smell this putrid stink, like old milk or rotten food. Then I saw the trees start to morph and move ever so slightly and began to take the shape of a head and slight facial features. My eyes began to adjust to the darkness, and along the tree line, I could hear this voice coming from there. I recognized it. The voice sounded like one of my relatives who had recently passed. The face took shape of my relative. "Hello," they said, "I've missed you. Come see me." I smiled and stepped forward a bit, but stopped to analyze the situation. My relative's face stopped smiling and became emotionless. The skin began to turn pale and peel away. Chunks of flesh from their cheeks began to fall away, and I felt shock and fear overwhelm my body. I couldn't make sense of it at all, so I started to back away and make my way to camp. I didn't realize at the time that I had been walking towards the voice and I was further away from the firelight. The voice became angry and began shouting at me to come here, so I turned to run away, but as I looked back one more time, I saw the most disgusting thing I had ever seen. It was rotting flesh on gnawed bone, gaping eyes, and a hollow chest cavity. This humanoid creature was tall and super thin. I ran as fast as I could, trying to yell for help, but the fear had made my voice quiet and raspy. I ran along the riverbank, and I could hear the heavy breaths and the stomping feet from this thing right behind me. I made it onto the top of the riverbank, but it grabbed a hold of my leg as I jumped up. I gripped and tore the grass, trying to lift myself, and yelled as loud as I could. Then finally my voice came back, and I yelled at someone as my leg. My brother woke up and ran over to where I was. Then he pulled me up and took me over to the fire. I was terrified, trying to explain what I saw and that it looked like my relative, but not. I was trying to convince them that I wasn't seeing things, but my brother nodded his head and said, "I saw it too. I know." That solidified it. He acknowledged that it was real. We stayed up all night after that, rifles loaded and close by. We packed up when the sun was coming up and went back home. We haven't shared that story with anyone out of fear of being labeled as crazy or liars. I've had nightmares and couldn't sleep for months afterwards. I would see things/dark figures looking into my window or hear whispers while I was walking home at night. Eventually, I was seeing this dark figure daily. I went to medicine men/shaman for help, but I've learned that the ceremonies only relieves it temporarily. Friends have given me everything from protection pouches to certain crystals. I found out that there's a strong possibility that I encountered a Wendigo. I learned that if you encounter one and survive, it attaches itself to you like a parasite. I learned that it could only do this if it touches you, which it did. Ever since that night, I've been on edge when I enter any forest or wooded area, which sucks because I love being outdoors/hunting and in nature. Now I always feel like I need to keep my back against something when I'm out in the wild. Anyways, make your own conclusions about this. I've paid a price for being an ignorant child to the stories of old. They are real, I can attest to that. Stay safe, everyone. My paternal family always had reports of ghosts. They said that our family is mediumistic and things like that. I saw a lot of things until I was 18 or 19 years old, or I thought I did, maybe because I believed in that my brain deceived me, or I don't know, but when I was about 16 something happened that I can't explain. I lived with my mother and my sister who was 4 years old at the time. One night I was putting out my dinner and it was already past midnight. That's when I heard a woman calling me, whispering. At the time I thought it was my mother and I asked what was it, and the voice called me again. I asked what it was again and the voice called me again. So I thought my mother was whispering so as not to wake my sister. So I went there and my mother was snoring. After that, all nights, always at the time I was going to sleep, which was usually between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning, this voice would call me. It would always be twice in a row. After a few seconds it would call again and again. I didn't tell my mother because she was always very fearful. After 5 days I was talking to my mother and she said that something strange had happened. Our house was at the end of my grandfather's backyard, and as he slept early he turned off the lights in the backyard when my mother was alone with my sister. She went to take a shower and left the bathroom door open so my sister could see her. My sister was playing and out of nowhere she stopped and looked at the backyard door, which was also open. My mother was she was scared and asked what it was, and my sister said that there was a girl calling me. My mother wrapped herself in a towel and looked at the backyard door and asked where this girl was, and my sister pointed to the dark and said, there in the dark there is a girl calling my brother. I asked her when this had happened and she said it was 5 days ago. I've seen demons, Victory, and it wasn't just once, it was 5 times. And each one was different from the other. And no, they weren't horned monsters with sharp tails and teeth. Their faces were always very different from each other. And before you say it wasn't just the night, there were also times when I was in broad daylight. It's strange because the demons had a physiognomy that was often just strange, not scary like in films or books. But even though they're not scary, you know just by looking that they're demons. And some didn't show a scary aura of killing you, just that they were there to be. One the first time was in the afternoon, the sun was almost disappearing. I was passing by the living room and my parents were watching TV. But when I looked at him next to the sofa there was darkness next to him. It was like a being with no defined shape, no arms or legs, no head. It was just an empty hole. An abyss to look at. I still have the image stuck in my head because it was my first experience. He wasn't very big, he was the size of an adult. But he had no physiognomy, just a hole. To my second was at night. I was going to sleep, but before I went to look at the sky to see if there were stars. Since I was little, I have liked looking at the sky and observe the few stars that exist and can survive in the midst of darkness. But when I went to look, I ended up looking at my uncle's roof. The roof isn't high, with just one jump I can get on it. And the window is very close to her. The backyard light was on as usual. About what I saw on top of his roof was a hooded being with an old and worn knight's robe. I don't remember much of its shape, just the few details I remember. And even when I looked away, it didn't disappear. I had even taken a look in the yard outside the house to see if it was all in my head. Just the other day he disappeared. 3/3 was during the day. Around 1 p.m. I think. I was returning home, and as I walked I saw a thin man, like very thin to the point where you could see his bones. His skin was dark. He was sitting on the sidewalk. His clothes were a rag. And when I got close to see his face, it was a rotten skull. In the end I got scared and screamed, but when I looked away he disappeared. For Wednesday was also during the day, around 3 p.m. I was 15 or 16 years old. I lived in Mangarab at that time. A city surrounded by forest and full of mountains. I was climbing part of the mountain on foot with my mother to go home. Because at a certain point on the road the car wouldn't go up. And as I was climbing I looked at a rock next to me, like it was next to the road. It must have been about 3 meters high. And when I looked at her, a being that I don't know how to describe because I can't put it into words, her face was holding onto the rock, looking at me as I walked, as if she was ensuring that no one would touch the rock. While I lost focus to respond, my mother disappeared. 5 is the one that I really have details to remember. It was late, a cloudy day. I was walking down the street. I was 16. And I ended up seeing a creature that was half cat and half wolf. Its fur was different colors like a rainbow. That's all I remember about her. And when I was distracted, she disappeared.